Yo, yo, yo. I have one quick announcement. So we were running this contest to celebrate our 50th episode. Basically, you had to just give us a review on any platform that you're using. So that could be Apple, that could be Spotify. And if you give a review, we basically put your name into a hat, literally a physical hat. We did this physically. And drew your name. So we actually picked two winners for this one. So you get full access to our content strategy course. Sorry for any mispronunciations, but Abbas Sarawi and Emma Fanning. So I'm going to follow up with you guys. I'm going to shoot you an email, but you'll have full access to our course. So felicidades, congratulations, and thank you so much. All right, on with the show.
Hello. This is David Kim from Omniscient Digital, and you're listening to The Long Game. In this conversation, I speak with Alfie Marsh, the head of US go-to-market at Spendesk, a corporate card and expense management software that helps businesses control budget, pay vendors, and track all company spend. In our conversation, we started off talking about Alfie's role as the head of US expansion for Spendesk, and then we pivot to talk about his humble beginnings, how he thinks about his long game, and the importance of taking care of mental health, particularly in the workplace. He even shares his most impactful piece of advice he got from Matthew McConaughey. Now, without further ado, here's my conversation with Alfie Marsh. All right, Alfie. So it's great to have you on the Long Game podcast. Thanks so much for making the time.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Yeah, it's a new year. It seems like the first week is always everyone firing off on all cylinders, going hard the first week. How are you feeling going into 2022?
I'm feeling good. I feel well rested. I was in a cabin in the middle of the forest in near Tahoe over Christmas, and I don't know if you saw, there was a big snowstorm, 2 meters of snow, and that was a really fun way to spend Christmas. So I feel well fed, well rested, and ready to rock and roll.
That's amazing. A couple of years ago, I was in Tahoe right around this time too. I think they got 9 feet of snow, and we were freaking out. We were supposed to stay for another 2 nights, and we had to rush, change our flights, and get out that day before the storm came in. But sounds like that's a pretty common occurrence out there.
It was pretty gnarly. I think it was. There was. We ended up getting stuck there for 3 extra days, and you could literally swim through snow. But that's another story for another day.
Yeah, cool. All right, well, let's jump straight into it because you have an interesting background. You started off in finance and investment banking, moved into sales, and then now you're leading US go-to-market at Spendesk. Tell us about that journey. What did it all look? What were the decisions you had to make starting from your background in investment banking?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I originally, I grew up from, relatively humble beginnings, and to be quite frank with you, most of my mindset, I've always been ambitious, always been hungry, and as a teenager, my mindset was always, I want to make money and be successful. And for me, it was kind of going through that period of time with the 2007, 2008 financial crisis. It was funny because although it was a big financial crisis, it was also a lot of headlines of like bankers making X amount of money. And, a lot of people might have hated the industry, but I was like, oh, there's quite a lot of money being made actually over there. Maybe I should go over there. And so I kind of, set my career path trajectory to go into, banking and that kind of side of things. Anyway, ended up working at Bloomberg, which is not an investment bank. We ended up selling. I ended up selling trading solutions, electronic trading solutions to banks and hedge funds. So I was in that space, but not directly working there. But it was a funny time because ultimately the industry is in big decline. Every week I was there was hundreds of people being laid off from all of the clients that we had. So it was kind of a weird time. But at the same time, similar to me, there was a lot of other people that were, chasing the paychecks, so wanting to get into the industry. So you've kind of got like a dying industry, but lots of people applying still. So super competitive. So it was just a very cutthroat kind of time. And anyway, what I kind of realized is I actually really like finance. I did study accounting and finance. I liked the markets, like financial markets. But I was actually prevented from doing any sort of trading or anything like that whilst working at Bloomberg because it was against the compliance. We had access to a lot of data. So I was like, well, I'm not actually able to do the thing I actually kind of like. I'm not actually technically in banking. I was like, I'm not actually sure this is an industry I really want to be a part of anyway. And all of that kind of came at a time, there was about 20,000 employees in the company. And you'd be having conversations with some of the old guys that have been there for 20 plus years. And the thing that always excited me was the conversations of back in the day, in the old days, when it was, a few hundred people, and they used to, this is a fun fact, Bloomberg has one of the largest private fish collection in the world, like tropical fish collection in the world.
Fish collections, okay.
Yeah. It's like guaranteed largest in Europe and unofficial largest in the world. And the reason why is they started buying a goldfish for every Bloomberg terminal that they sold. And then they've obviously sold a few over time. And then it kind of just grew into this thing. But, it's stories like that, kind of just like, when the whole market was there for the taking and you're going against the banks and creating this innovative product. And it's all this, kind of like competitiveness, and it's entrepreneurial kind of endeavors. And that's actually what got me going. And I was like, here at 20,000 people, I'm a cog in a machine. It's also an industry I'm not too keen about. So I need to be in a startup. I need to be in the genesis of something, looking at the market where it's all for the taking. So,
what year was that when you decided that?
So I'm trying to think, when did I start there? So I must have started in 2014, and I was there for just under 3 years. So about 2017. And I'd say about halfway through is really when I had that kind of realization, but didn't pull the trigger till a lot later. And then, I met my now wife from working in the company, who's French. And we both decided to quit on the same day, and we both moved to France. I didn't have a job, didn't speak a word of French, and decided to go and look for a job in the French startup ecosystem. And then, a few years later, here I am.
I applaud that. What was that transition like, moving to France, not speaking the language, trying to get a job out there? You're the second person I know that has done that. My other friend did it in Sweden.
Wow.
So, curious how you find that transition.
Yeah, I'm not going to lie. It was tough. I think that was probably one of the toughest periods, I think, in my life, for multiple reasons. We could talk about it, I think, a bit later on the podcast. But when I actually left Bloomberg, I went through a period, I burnt out, and I had a really tough time. So I was cutting something off at the same time that I'm also wanting to start this new journey in a new field where I don't really know anything about, also in a country where I don't speak the language, and you kind of need to learn French to have a decent kind of living out there. So it was really tough. But I think I've always found that when my back is up against the wall is actually when I produce the best results. I'm the most creative and the most innovative, and it all worked out pretty well in the end.
Yeah, it's interesting how that works, because it kind of sucks in the moment. You're feeling stressed. You feel like you're definitely hitting burnout, but for some reason, ironically, you're producing really well. So that's really cool to hear.
Yeah, if you were to speak to my wife's mother, whose house we were staying in at the time, I actually was applying for roles as a salesperson in French startups, but I was applying because there was more of these jobs for French sales roles, right? I didn't speak French at the time, so I was learning French at the time. So I'm there. I've got this phone interview with the CEO of this startup, and it's in French. And I'm being pretty, I don't know, what's the word? Pretty confident for my level at the time, but my wife's mum always laughs back at that, because it was like a hilarious moment. It was like the worst French ever, and obviously it didn't go very well. We ended up cutting the call too short. That person actually ended up becoming a client of ours when I was working at Spendesk, and we invited them to our office on a completely random thing, and recounted that experience, and it just reminds me of the transition of the journey. But I came across Spendesk, and luckily they were looking for someone to look after the UK market. So I had a good in there.
Yeah, it all works out. And so you were first focused on UK market. Now you're heading up the go-to-market in the US. What has your role at Spendesk look like, and what's your day-to-day look like now?
Yeah, so I think I've had kind of two core fundamental tours of duty, if you like, in the company. I've been here for nearly about 4 years. the first 2 years of my career at Spendesk were really the first tour, and that was the UK market. I had 3 years of corporate experience. I was more in enterprise sales, in finance, but again, it's not startup. So when I went to Spendesk, I was very well aware that I was going into a new realm, and I'm going to have to learn everything from scratch. But I knew that my path would be accelerated. I knew in my head that was my opinion of what was going to happen. It luckily turned out to be that way, because I kind of already had some experience, but I needed to kind of learn everything from scratch. So I started off as an SDR, and then went from SDR to then doing full cycle sales, closing. I was the first salesperson in the team, and then grew that team, hired the first person, grew it into the first million of revenue, and built the first kind of foundation nucleus of what would be the UK revenue team, so about 6 to 8 people. And then at that point, there was kind of a decision for me of I've done that. I've done the 0 to 1 in this market. I've got that up and running now. Do I lean into this and then go from the 1 to 10 journey and really kind of scale that up, or do I do the same thing for Spendesk in the US in a much kind of bigger pond, if you like? And for me, I really like the early stage of the company. I mean, a lot of the stuff I write about, a lot of conversations I have with other people like yourself, outside when how we met, is really about those kind of early stages and figuring that part out. And that's really what interested me. So I knew we were going to at some point open up in the US. And so I kind of, put my coin in the hat, so to speak. And, a couple of years later, here I am.
Yeah. And so now go-to-market is kind of a nebulous phrase. I think it means different things to different people. What does it look like when you're trying to expand from France into the US? Usually you hear stories about expanding outside from the US to EMEA. What does it look like for you?
Yes. So I think there's certain phases to any go-to-market. And I think where people get confused is where multiple phases kind of happen in once, depending on the type of company you are and where you are in the stage. But ultimately, you need to build the company from scratch in any new market and take it from the ground up. Now, that process might be accelerated for some companies, and it may take longer if you haven't got a product market fit. But ultimately, you still need to understand the market, understand the target addressable market. How big is it there? What are your customers' problems, and how can you solve that? And does your product or solution actually respond to those problems well enough? From any go-to-market, I think one of the mistakes that is made is we've got something that's working in, let's say, the UK. Is that going to work in the US? And the assumption is, well, it works here, so let's just kind of replicate what we're doing and just put money into it and expect results. And that's never the case. And if that is the way that a go-to-market is kind of operated, it's almost doomed for failure. So you have to kind of take a beginner's mindset and take the mindset that you're building the company up from scratch from day one. Even if you're a large corporation and that process will be accelerated, you still have to start with the basic principles.
How did you, so in my previous roles, I wasn't the one in charge of doing the international expansion outside of the US, but there were internal documents and stuff about, the company's successful now, but it was like, oh, here are the things we learned. We realized that go-to-market for the US didn't make sense in Japan or in India. We had to adopt to what those different cultures and what the business culture is like there, which sounds obvious in retrospect. And I imagine the pushback you might have gotten was, well, but we already have this playbook. Can't we just try it to start? How did you encourage the team to also adopt that beginner's mindset and say, hey, we need to build this from scratch. We need to test our assumptions?
Yeah. So I think there's a distinction to be made in that having the assumptions, you have to have assumptions when you go and do a go-to-market. And it's just that people were making assumptions subconsciously or just not really thinking about it. But they're saying, the idea of it works in the UK, it's going to work in the US. Whether it's said or not said, it is an assumption. And that's actually not a problem. That's actually, you want that. You want to write a list of hypotheses down, and then your goal is to validate whether they are correct or not, and then take that information in the feedback loop and change the product or change who you sell to or how you position it. and then move on from there. So actually, that's exactly what we did. We said we work in the UK, we got this ICP, and this is the value proposition. How else are we going to go to market? Well, we're going to go to the same segment, and we're going to try with the same pitch and the same thing, because that's actually is a lot of there's a lot of data in there that is helpful, and it's a pretty good accurate way to start. Even if you're really wrong, it's a really good place to start. The point where people go wrong is where they are fixated on that and they stay too long in that segment if they don't have product market fit. And the reason that happens is because they're not looking to validate or nullify a hypothesis. What they're trying to do is just get revenue off of a business model which they are assuming works. And that's the difference. You can start with what works, but you just have to be in that mindset of looking out for if it's not, and if so, what are you doing? Are you getting the feedback? And one very clear example is if you're too much in a sales mindset when you go to a new country, you'll be trying to close the deal. You won't be trying to learn why the deal isn't closing if it doesn't. And that's a big distinction, because if you don't have the data coming in the feedback loop, you won't be able to iterate or change the positioning. What's more important than getting revenue is learning why you're getting it or why you're not getting it. And so that's why it helps to have this mindset from day one, even if you are going with the same assumptions in your domestic market.
Yeah. And what did you find helped with that sort of expansion? I think, correct me if I'm wrong, in some of our previous conversations before this, you had mentioned we kind of already had some content that was helping with getting into the US market. What are some examples of things that helped you accelerate those learnings?
Yeah, so for context, Spendesk is historically predominantly an outbound sales driven company, our go-to-market. Excuse me. And so we've got a lot of experience in generating leads and opportunities really from an outbound SDR approach. And that was extremely helpful, because when you don't have any resources and when you don't have any kind of focus, it's actually outbound's a really hard thing to get started if you've never done it before. And it requires a very specific kind of skill set. And we were able to leverage that just to get meetings straight away. So we were never short of meetings with customers. We were always meeting with potential customers and learning from day one. And I think the most important thing is what's the velocity of your pipeline in terms of how many people are you speaking with and for which types of segments and types of customers. So that was a really big help. The other one you mentioned was content. So we were lucky that we invested very early on. Spendesk is about 5.5 years old. We invested very early on in content and SEO in particular. And a lot of that was in English for our UK market, which naturally corresponds to the US. And so just at the same sort of time that we're starting to pick up a bit of traction in terms of a product market fit, that content was also producing results for the inbound in the US. And so that was, kind of lucky. So I think that the biggest help is having a healthy way to find and interact with customers is the most important thing.
Yeah. And so that's all really interesting, hearing how somewhere along the line, someone decided early on, we need to do content in English, and that was a helpful way to expand into the US. So I want to change gears a little bit. You mentioned something earlier at the beginning of this interview where you mentioned humble beginnings, and the sense I get is you're very driven. I notice you have a newsletter, Rocket GTM, which we'll link to in the show notes. You have a YouTube channel that you're creating some content for. What does your long game look like? What are you thinking about for your career, or what you're trying to build for yourself in the long term?
Yeah, I think when I grew up, I started working at an early age. I started working about 12, 13 years old, and I've worked.
What kind of job did you have?
So my first ever job was a paper round. So I delivered newspapers in my local area. I quit that after about 6 months because
you quit your job. Okay.
I quit my job after about 6 months because there was another job in my local music shop where it was basically a Saturday boy, managed the till. They gave private music lessons and sold musical instruments. And that's kind of where I actually fell into loving sales, because I was just selling all day long and also playing guitar all day long, which was great. But from then on, I just got the bug for kind of like independence through financial freedom, and that's kind of where I got my work ethic. However, I think it's only really until I actually started working in the startup world where I realized that hard work is a prerequisite, I think, to be successful, but it's actually not the thing. It's not the most important thing. And you need to create things. And if you really want to have a big impact, is to have ownership over what you're creating, whether that's you have shares in a company of a startup or you have your own business that you're doing, to have that full ownership of that. So this hard work is going to get you a lot of places, but there's a lot of people that work really hard and aren't necessarily having the biggest impact in the world. It's very localized. So for me, I wanted to have an outsized impact, a leverage impact. And I think the best way to do that is entrepreneurship. So for me, the end goal has really been to launch my own company, which is another reason why throughout my career path, I've really chosen those 0 to 1 kind of go to market phases, because I love that idea of I'm learning on someone else's dime and I'm taking lots of risks on someone else's money. And not only that, but I'm getting paid for it, which is great. But this is like a university. This is my MBA in entrepreneurship. And I can take all those risks and those learnings before I then go and put my stake in the ground and do that myself. So clearly, the end goal has always been that. Where that relates to things like the newsletter, this is actually, one of the ways that, we got into conversation is, for me, the newsletter enables me to speak my mind, articulate my thoughts and explore certain things. But actually the audience that it then brings in creates opportunities and conversations. And I think that I'm just trying to increase my exposure to serendipitous opportunity in a nutshell with things like that.
Yeah, I love that. And your talking point around the MBA, real life MBA, really resonated with me. I was just chatting with someone else earlier today, and we were both talking about how we both decided not to go to business school intentionally, right? It was something for me. I revisited the idea every couple of months for a couple of years. I took the GREs, I got my test scores and was starting to do applications. And at some point I said, you know what? These jobs I'm getting are jobs people want to get after getting their business degree. I'm learning a ton right now already. Why spend $200,000-$300,000 when I could be getting paid to learn? So I think we maybe landed on the same conclusion there. I don't know if a MBA is somewhere in your path you're thinking.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
No.
So you mentioned humble beginnings, financial freedom. I'm kind of tying some dots together here. Tell me more about that. Typically, when folks mention financial freedom, there's something probably from their upbringing. Maybe I'm speaking, maybe I'm projecting, that made them have that goal.
Yeah. I don't know. I spent a lot of time, introspecting and I guess trying to figure that out. I mean, I did come from humble upbringings, and I think, where I grew up, there's a lot of people that kind of still in the same area and not necessarily exploring the world or kind of, reaching their full potential. And that just never really interested me. I was always kind of looking outside the initial bubble that I was, that I grew up in, and was always looking to do more. And at each stage, I think throughout my life, I got closer and closer to kind of more like-minded people. Whereas when I went to university, there was more people that were interested in studying or getting a degree. And so naturally you have more overlap. And now I live in San Francisco, and there's a bunch of entrepreneurs and super ambitious people. It's not even necessarily in entrepreneurship, but there's a sense of people want to change the world and have an impact here in one way, shape or form. And I absolutely love that. So I feel like it's just a constant drive, I guess, to kind of, reach some sort of full potential.
Yeah. I appreciate that. I don't know if you listen to David Goggins. I know he's not for everyone, but he's always on that grind of like, it doesn't end, but I'm always trying to get better. And I've been re-listening to interviews and stuff with him, and it just gets me going. It keeps me focused.
Yeah. And I think there's something about, having an outsized leveraged impact in the world where you can do something that kind of transcends, yourself. And I mean, that when I talk about the ambition from when I was younger. I think the difference between how I am now to when I was maybe 15, 16 is I wanted to be successful to make myself like rich or have money myself. Whereas I feel like that's still a motivation, but I think that in itself, it's more to have an impact, a bigger impact. Like I know that I've got good skill sets in certain areas, and it's like, what's the best application of that skill set? Is it in a local area where I just do something in my local community, or could you have an impact with that set of skills that is unique to you on like a global level? And I think, well, if you can have a global level impact, then why not? That's amazing.
Yeah.
So I kind of want to, leave a good footprint somewhere.
Yeah, you've mentioned outsized leveraged impact a couple of times. What does impact look like for you?
I think to positively change someone's life for the better. I think, and that really depends on the person that it changes. For some people, that may just be to like inspire someone. For others, that may be to improve their, financial ability or freedom through, better education, or maybe it's just for other people, it's just managing mental health better. It could be many, many different things to different people. I mean, to give an example in a more of a localized context, one of the reasons why I write newsletters or post on LinkedIn or produce content is a lot of the work that you do within a company often stays within the company, and no one else can either know about, learn about, or benefit from what you've learned unless it's kind of shared externally. And that's also going towards your kind of career growth as well. If people only in your surrounding know about how you've helped that company grow, then that obviously it's better if more people are aware of that for your own personal benefit. So it also overlaps there. But something that I found since I moved to San Francisco is I've done way more calls with other entrepreneurs or people doing similar go-to-market things, and just sort of sharing knowledge and kind of, consulting with one another. And I think that kind of knowledge sharing, I love that. I really enjoy having a conversation, unlocking some sort of thing in the way a company's positioning their product. And then, 3 weeks later, 3 months later, they have a significant change in their pipeline or their revenue because of something that you've discussed together. Mm-hmm. That to me, that brings me joy. We have lots of words for kind of sharing negative emotions like sympathy or empathy, but it's kind of weird that in the English language, we don't have a word for, sharing vicarious joy. It's like, how do you get joy from someone else's joy? Like, we don't actually have a word for that. And that kind of seems kind of crazy to me because
what made you come up with that realization? Is there a word for that in another language that you might have heard?
Yeah, I think there is. It's in. I'm trying to think which language it is in. Is it maybe in Greek? I'll have to look at my research, but I came across it, and that was exactly the point. There's a language in there because I learned French when I was in France, and one of the beautiful things about that is a culture unlocks the way people speak and the phrases that they use. You see the world in a different place. There's phrases that explain my emotions better in French than in English, and vice versa. Luckily, I can use both with my wife, but you can't do that with everyone. And so that was one of the examples. Vicarious joy doesn't exist in the English language. Does that mean it's not important to our culture? Whereas it is important in other cultures where there is an actual word for it.
Yeah, that makes me a little sad that we don't have a word for that. Maybe we just start saying vicarious joy.
I think so.
So you mentioned another thing a couple of times here is mental health. I imagine, with this sort of ambition, you hit points of burnout maybe multiple times in your life. How have you worked through that? Maybe for yourself, maybe I imagine for your team too.
Yeah, so the biggest experience I had was when I was at Bloomberg, and I've spoken about this before on a few other podcasts. But I think for a long story short, I experienced burnout after 2.5, 3 years of working at Bloomberg, at which point I left and then went into the startup world. And one thing that I did learn from that is it's really not correlated to hard work or working hard. And I think that I've worked 10 times harder at Spendesk than I have when I was at Bloomberg. And it's a completely different dynamic. And the stress is a different kind of stress. It's not like a burnout stress. It's kind of, And I had to look at that and think, okay, what is the distinction between the two? And I think that ultimately what I learned is what was driving me, my goals, my motivations were actually misaligned with who I was as a person when I was at Bloomberg. Like I said to you, when I grew up, I was thinking of financial freedom, success, and investment banking and making money. And it's all me, individualistic kind of thinking. And ultimately, like, you chase that, it goes well, and if you're getting promoted and make money, then you're happy and you're fine. But as soon as you encounter challenges or difficult situations, it's kind of like, it goes wrong very quickly because you're not there for the right reasons. And so it only goes well when it's going well. And so you need to find something where when it's not going well, it's still aligned with your values, your morals, your true motivations. And I think that gives you the ability to drive through those tough times, basically. And I found that pivot personally in my career that made it a huge difference. So I think firstly, if you're experiencing burnout, part of it is you've got to look at, are you in the right place in the first place is a big part of it. And then there's obviously a lot of different ways that you can kind of manage on a more managing a symptom basis, but prevention is always better than cure. And I think that to prevent that sort of situation from arising, you have to be in the right place for the right reasons.
Yeah. It sounds like you've done a ton of introspection on this. Were there any particular resources or books or anything that you consumed that helped you get to this sort of realization, or was this kind of pure introspection?
I mean, a real amalgamation of lots of things. I started meditating at the time. Started doing therapy, which I think is everyone should do, even if you're not going through burnout. Agreed. I think still do that now. I feel completely fine, and I think therapy is just a great thing to do. It's like you go to the gym, you should see a therapist. And yeah, a lot of reading and just kind of understanding myself and understanding what my motivations were. A lot of introspection, writing things down on a piece of paper, just write a brain drain. Everything that comes to your mind, write it down and see what comes out, and you'll start seeing themes occur and just question everything. Well, why do I think like that? Why do I want to make a lot of money? Okay, but why is that important to me? For what reasons? And then you kind of come up with some answers. And towards the career side of things, there's a book I would recommend everyone read called Now Discover Your Strengths. Mm-hmm. I think it's by a guy called Mark Buchanan, if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong. But my VP of sales, Nicholas Marsh, he recommended that to me about 2-3 years ago, maybe. And I wish I read that a lot earlier. And this book effectively states that everybody has their natural talents. And the best thing to do is figure out what your talents are or your strengths, and then build skills on top of those naturally occurring talents. So if I'm not naturally good at math, but I can build skills on top of that. Like I studied accounting and finance. Like I'm not that great at math, but you can build that skill. But is that the best way? No, because I'm not naturally talented at that. But I'm naturally talented at speaking with people and interacting with people that I don't know. And I really get energy from that sort of situation. That might just be a natural talent or a strength. But what's a skill set that I could build on top of that? Well, negotiation, sales, so on and so forth. And so reading that book, they break it down to about 30, 32, I think, different strengths. You'll read it and be like, oh, that's me. And oh, that's really not me. And then you kind of get a picture of who you are. And that's a really good basis to then be like, okay, where should I then build a career on top of that? And what sort of skills and assets should I try and build? So that was a really good one. And then another book I would recommend, and this was actually recommended to me by a guy I worked with at Bloomberg who was a lot older, had more experience. And it's called Who Moved My Cheese? And it's a famous book. It's been read millions of times. I'm sure other people have already heard of this. It's a tiny little book. That.
No.
Have you not? Okay.
No.
It's amazing.
Okay.
It's a tale of a couple of mice who were trapped in a maze. But it's a very, very, you could read it in about 20 minutes. But it will really change your perspective on things. And effectively, the moral of the story is, life changes all the time. And there's two kind of people. There's people that are nostalgic about their old times, and they kind of stuck in the old way. And then there's others who see that their cheese has moved, and the opportunities have changed, and they adapt quickly to that. They don't get comfortable in the status quo. And so a lot of this friction when people get burnt out is things change. Like when I was in Bloomberg, there was 3 departments merged into one, a third of people were made redundant, and my job changed overnight. And that change I really didn't like. But I could see that coming actually, but I stayed there for long enough. And my issue was I didn't move quick enough. I didn't change my reaction to that quick enough.
Yeah. It reminds me of this. I was listening to a Sam Harris podcast the other day. I forgot who was interviewing, but it's this idea of like chosen suffering. Like you might have decided on the goals that you want to achieve, but have you thought about the type of suffering you'll have to go through to achieve those goals? And if not, you should probably think about that and ask yourself if you're willing to go through that type of suffering. Whereas, once you reflect and you decide, actually, this is really fucking hard, but I'm willing to go through the challenges in order to achieve that goal. It completely changes the narrative you tell yourself and whether or not you get burned out.
100%. And this is the difference of like the hard work and the reason the alignment, because there is a difference between pain and suffering. Pain, you can't choose whether you experience pain. That kind of just will happen, right? Life happens, but you can choose whether you suffer. The suffering is your reaction to the pain. And, what's the difference between working really hard in a job you don't like and a job you do like? You're still working really hard. You're doing the hours. You're tired. You need more coffee. It's the same situation. It's the same pain response or same pain stimulation, but the suffering, the response is different. You either suffer or you don't. And that is all mental. So
yeah, love it. And we'll make sure to link to those books in the show notes as well. So I have a couple questions that we can use to wrap up this conversation. You can take as much time as you'd like to respond to them. First one I love to ask is, what's an opinion you have about business that you think most people would disagree with?
This is this is like from the Peter Thiel question, right? What's the unpopular opinion? I love this question. I'm not sure if it's just specifically applicable to business or just in life in general and therefore applicable to business. But I think most problems in the world can be solved by starting with yourself and taking ownership over your input, and rather than kind of externally trying to change things. I spend more of my time trying to change myself than I think trying to change other things outside. And it's not so much I think that people would consciously disagree with that, but in terms of a lot of people's actions, I think many people, their actions would indicate that they're trying to change the external things rather than focusing on what they can do about it. And I think that creates a lot less friction if you start with the man in the mirror. Yeah.
It reminds me of, I keep quoting all these other books, but I'm just tying a lot of dots of like Jocko Willink's book, if you heard of it, or Extreme Ownership. Oh, someone didn't understand you. You didn't communicate good enough. Like, it's all on you.
It's true.
Love it. Yeah.
Honestly, just lastly on that, it really does change your interactions with the world and people when you take that. It doesn't mean that you're responsible for everything, but if you just own what you can control, like the world just seems to change. Things work out for the better. It's a powerful book.
Yeah, love it. And it sounds like you've had a couple mentors or folks you've turned to and learned from throughout the years. So what's the most impactful piece of advice you've been given?
That's a very hard question.
It's not meant to stump you. Could be any piece of advice.
Well, there's just many different routes I could go down, but there's I think it's either like an Oscar acceptance speech or a college degree like reward ceremony speech. It's from Matthew McConaughey, and I really like it because he's asked a question of like who's his idol, etc. And ultimately, the answer is it's his future self, and it's not other people. And the point of his story, and again, maybe you can link it down in the show notes. It's really good to watch. Is effectively that you shouldn't compare yourself to other people or external things. You should just compare yourself to who you were yesterday. And it's like, should you compare, how much you can squat in the gym to the guy that's standing next to you, or should you compare yourself to what you squatted last week and where you are now? And I think when you can actually align yourself there, the world becomes a much prettier place, because most people are generally improving a lot of the time compared to who they were before. And if you actually sat down and wrote everything down that you've achieved and how you've grown and changed and improved, it's quite positive. It's only when you compare things to that are out of your control. You can't control if someone else is better than you at this period in time. They're on a different trajectory, a different story. And then the second one is, there was a quote, I think it's from Sam, the guy from Y Combinator. And he was saying, it's not about the y-intercept, it's about the rate of growth. And basically what he's trying to say is, it's not where you start your curve, it's the rate of growth of the curve, and that speaks a lot to me, because the whole thing with the investment banking thing when I was younger, I always felt like I was 2 steps behind, because all these kids they'd already done an internship and they've already done this thing and they got them the next step. And I never had that because no one talked about that when I was in school. It wasn't on the card.
Same.
So
yeah,
I was just always 2 steps behind, and I always had a chip on my shoulder about it. And I think that, again, going into the startup world, it's one of the reasons why I love it, is the people that succeed are the ones who have the biggest, who are the biggest learners and have the biggest growth mindset. And so it doesn't matter where you start, it's how quick you then progress. And so that's the kind of two big things for me. Focus on yourself and where you are from yesterday and tomorrow. And it's your growth of progression that matters, not where you started.
Yeah, I love that. I think we might have had maybe some similarities in our upbringings. I had no clue what to do around applying for college. I once went on a date with someone and they were like, oh, what Ivy League school did you want to go to? And I told her, I didn't know what an Ivy League school was in high school. What the hell is that? And it just totally confused this person. But yeah, I love the idea of just comparing yourself to yourself. That's something I've personally had to learn the hard way as well. You kind of answered this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, because I'm curious if you have a different answer. Who are you chasing professionally? Or who do you admire professionally that you kind of look to as a model?
I mean, yeah, it's exactly what I just said a minute ago. Yeah. It's the best version of myself, really. Yeah. And any time it starts to veer off of that is when I have negative mental thoughts and tend to get burnt out and stressed. And I think it's like, as long as it's the best version of me, that's the most important.
Yeah. Well, what do you do when you get down those unfavorable paths? I think it's very relevant considering we're going into year number 3 of a pandemic. Folks have kind of been left to maybe some of those thoughts more than usual. How do you kind of work through those situations?
Yeah. So whenever I'm having like a rough kind of period, mental health wise, I always see that's like what I'm experiencing is a symptom of something. And for me, it's really time to first do an audit. And it's an audit of, okay, what am I eating? Because it has a huge impact on your mental health, and your physical health has a huge impact on your mental health. So what am I eating? And there's always often a correlation when I'm eating bad, eating lots of sugar, high starchy kind of foods and just junk food over a period of time. So I clean up my diet is the number one thing. And then I say, okay, how much am I moving? Am I exercising? Am I burning calories? And not just walking, but high intensity. How much am I sweating? How much is my heart rate above a certain period of time? And effectively, if it's, again, there's generally a strong correlation. If I'm not consistent with eating well or being physically fit, then all the other stuff tends to go downhill as well. So I kind of fix those two things first. And then the third thing is I lay all the things out. And a lot of the time when I'm stressed, it's because I'm trying to control things that are outside of my control. And so I write a list down of everything that is what is in my control and what is outside of my control. And the things that are outside of my control, I can underline them and put them to one side of the page. And then the ones that are inside my control, I say, well, what am I actually doing to impact that in the direction that I want it to? And some of the time, or a lot of the time, I'm probably not actually doing anything about the things I can control. And I'm just focused on the things I can't and getting frustrated at them. And that is a pretty healthy kind of introspection exercise whenever you're having a tough time. But then you have to do the hard work and take the steps, clean up your diet, get out, go for a run, and get off your ass and do something about those things that you can control.
Yeah, it's fascinating that diet and some sort of physical activity are the first 2 things you go to before that list of things in your control. It sounds like you're thinking about it very holistically.
Well, I think that for me, what I focus on tends to end up going the wrong way when my just general lifestyle isn't good. Like if I'm not having good social, and one thing I didn't put in there, I definitely should have, alongside with the eating well and exercising, is your social connections. Like, are you spending enough time with your respective partner, with your friends, with your family? Do you feel connected? Do you have things that are important outside of work, for example, that are going well? Are you enjoying your hobbies? Like those things also are really important as well. And I think if those bases aren't covered, then whatever the stress is in the work side, for example, is just amplified. And I think you can kind of, decrease a lot of that just by making sure your other things are in check.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that idea of writing down a list of what's under your control too. Because once you lay that out, then you can actually decide, okay, I can actually do something about this. Do I want to, or is it even that important to me? That sounds like a great exercise that we could all be doing.
Exactly.
Yeah. So last question, where can people find you on the internet?
Yeah. Easiest way is either on LinkedIn. If you actually want to speak to me and get a reply, it's pretty hard on LinkedIn. But I reply to anyone that sends an email after my newsletter. So it goes out every Monday evening or Tuesday morning, depending on where you live in the world. And if you reply back to that, I reply to everyone that sends a response to those emails. So if you actually want to get in touch, that's the best way. And if you want to join up to the newsletter, it's Rocket GTM. You can go to rocketgtm.co, rocketgtm.co, and you can just subscribe and you'll get that in your inbox every Sunday.
Awesome. We'll make sure to add that to the show notes. Thanks again for the time, Alfie. This was an awesome conversation.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me.